Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the Thousand Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to follow. When Kisuke Urahara finally revealed his Bankai after years of anticipation and teases, needless to say, expectations were extraordinarily high. And, at least as far as I was concerned, the Bankai not only met those expectations, but exceeded them. And I've gone on record before saying that this is my favourite Bankai. Kannonbiraki Benehime Aratame is so uniquely perfect for Kisuke that it could have only been devised by Kubo himself, who has such a thorough understanding, a complete understanding of his characters and world. This Bankai gives Kisuke the power to restructure anything, effectively letting him shape the world and those who live within it to his liking. But with a Bankai this powerful, one that can frankly reshape reality before our very eyes, comes risk. Why did it take Kisuke so long to finally use it? What about the specific parameters of his battle with Askin lined up so perfectly that the Puppet Master felt he could finally unveil his greatest, most dangerous weapon when he didn't even use it against Aizen? What did the few teases that we had of his Bankai in the long lead up to the reveal really mean, and how do they reflect upon the Bankai's actual ability now that we know it? In today's video, we're going to dive deeper into why Kisuke feared using his Bankai at the wrong moment, and why everything had to fall into place before he could take the ultimate gamble. Let's take a look. Of course, if you ended up enjoying today's video, consider hitting subscribe down below to help support the channel on our journey to 300,000 subscribers, which is only going to be possible with your help. It is greatly appreciated, as is checking out the Patreon as well, where you can take your support for the channel an extra step further. And again, it really all does mean so very much, and it all goes a very, very long way. So a huge thank you to everyone who is supporting the channel, whether that's simply by subscribing or you are a patron supporter as well. A huge thank you. I really do appreciate it. There's no doubt that Kisuke's Bankai was one of the most anticipated of the entire series, and for good reason. In fact, I've said it before that it's clear Kubo was on a wish fulfillment spree during Varvelt, clearly aware the series was wrapping up fast, maybe faster than originally intended, and decided to bash out three of the most anticipated Bankai all in a row. Kyoraku, Urahara, and then Kenpachi, in what I would say is a pretty crazy streak. All three of these Bankai are used within the space of like 2 volumes or something like that. All three Bankai, by the way, that we as readers had been waiting, something like a decade to see. Prior to the reveal of Kisuke's Bankai, however, his true power had been teased numerous times throughout the series, all of which built up an idea of what this Bankai might be like in the community's collective mind way ahead of time. I know I certainly had my theories. The very first real tease came in chapter 132, when Yoruichi revealed that Kisuke was the only person to have achieved Bankai via the Tenshintai, a device of his own making, that forcibly externalized a Zanpakuto spirit for submission. Through this method, Kisuke achieved Bankai in only 3 days, and believed that taking any longer to do so would be dangerous. Then, the most explicit tease came in chapter 224, when Kisuke asked Renji to train Chad using his own Bankai, at the time Hihio Zabimaru. When Renji objects, calling out Kisuke for having a Bankai of his own, Kisuke mysteriously noted that his Bankai wasn't suitable for training or giving people strength at all. And then, of course, there was the overarching tease of Kisuke's Bankai that was, well, Kisuke's Shikai Benehime, that we saw in action numerous times over the course of the story. It was clear that not only was Benehime one of the strongest Shikai in Bleach, but it was one of the most versatile too, and based on the seemingly ironclad rule that all Bankai have at least vaguely the same ability as their Shikai, only generally on a much bigger scale, then Kisuke's elusive Bankai must at least have shared similar themes to that of Benehime. And then, of course, well, finally the time arrived. At the end of chapter 664, some 400 odd chapters or 8, nearly 9 years after that last tease I just mentioned, Kisuke released his Bankai, conjuring a gigantic wooden doll behind him that took on the form of Benihime herself, and over the course of the next chapter, the Bankai's ability became clear. Kannonbiraki Benihime Aratame has the power to restructure anything it touches, effectively giving it limitless capabilities in the right hands. Although we only spend a criminally short time with the Bankai, Kubo made sure to show us that yes, this Bankai can be used for, well, almost anything you can think of, blasting through virtually every single possible application or field of applications, while at the same time opening the door to potentially hundreds more, depending on the circumstances. In an instant, Benihime restructures Kisuke's destroyed eyes, completely restoring his sight. And that right there proves the Bankai has healing capabilities. To an extent, anyway, and we'll discuss what I mean by that a bit later on. Then, Kisuke restructures his own arm on the fly to bolster his physical strength, granting himself a newly modified and upgraded arm that enables him to easily overpower Askin in a contest of physical strength and send the Sternritter flying. Later, Kisuke also reveals that he created a portal, a gateway for Grimmjow to move through, using his Bankai to open a doorway within Askin's otherwise inescapable Gift Bereich, through which Grimmjow entered. While it could be a literal tunnel, I've always thought that the opening in the ground behind Askin at the start of chapter 666, from which Grimmjow struck, clearly looks like a portal, as though he teleported from one place to the other. But either way, it's the same principle. The Bankai can connect two spots and essentially restructure the landscape itself to allow for quick travel between them. And so that's Kubo going out of his way to cover healing, empowerment, and transportation all in the space of a few pages. But the Bankai clearly also has offensive capabilities outside of powering up Kisuke himself. For as soon as the Bankai appears, Askin's arm is split open as if dissected, but he then backs away and his arm stitches itself back up again. Now, I've always found this moment to be odd, and again, I'll discuss that further in a moment, but for now, that's basically everything we see the Bankai do, as Kisuke confesses to Askin that yes, his Bankai's ability operates within a range that one can seemingly move in and out of. So, after having seen it in action, now that we know what Kisuke's Bankai can do, the question, of course, comes back to why didn't he want to use it? What took so long to get here? And perhaps crucially, why isn't his Bankai suited for training people or for giving them strength? And I'll admit, after seeing it used for the very first time, I wondered that myself. After all, Kisuke quite literally uses his Bankai to give himself strength in the moment against Askin, so surely what we're looking at here is the perfect training accompaniment. Well, not quite, because you see, as Askin lies defeated by Kisuke and begins to die in chapter 666, his power of the death dealing goes haywire, ramping up the poison levels within the Gift Bereich to, well, a completely lethal amount. Of course, although he has a contingency plan in place for such an eventuality, the reality is that Kisuke still finds himself minutes from death all the same. While waiting for Nell to come and bail him out, Kisuke collapses to the ground and his Bankai crumbles behind him, literally falling to pieces like a huge statue being brought down. Benihime's head comes falling off. And as we know, the involuntary disengaging of one's Bankai is a sign that the user's death is imminent. Just as Kisuke is about to fall unconscious, we see that with the collapse of his Bankai, all of the changes that he's made to his own body are beginning to come undone. And herein lies the great weakness, the great disadvantage, that seemingly leads to Kisuke being fearful of using his Bankai unless it's exactly the right moment. As he continues to cough up blood, we can see that the stitches all over his body are beginning to reopen, causing him to bleed heavily from both his face and his arm. And what's interesting about that is that it doesn't seem to matter at all what kind of restructuring or remaking he underwent. Whether it was to fix something that was broken, or to empower something that wasn't already injured or damaged, it doesn't matter. Once the Bankai disengages, these stitches completely reopen, leaving Kisuke covered in wounds and vulnerable. And the reason why that's important is because I could understand why these stitches that fixed up Kisuke's eyes might begin to bleed profusely on his face when those ones started to open, because he was covering up essentially an injury, a serious wound that had already taken place. However, he applied the stitches, the changes to his own arm, when it technically on the surface didn't need it. It wasn't from the perspective of being healed, it was from the perspective of being upgraded. And so essentially he has done this to himself and is now bleeding heavily from the arm as a result. What this means is that while Benehime's Bankai absolutely is incredibly versatile and can seemingly make as many amends and fixes as Kisuke wants, it's all temporary. It's all fleeting, and not only that, but it seems to come at a cost as well. Once the Bankai disappears, these changes likely come undone as well, as we are seeing taking place on the page, and the more changes a person has had made to them, the more they are remade, the more they will come undone and bleed in the end. Going back very briefly to earlier in the video where I noted that this Bankai kind of has healing properties, although you can't really call it that, this is why. Ultimately, Kisuke can only really remake, in regards to healing, that which has been destroyed, but it's only going to be temporary at best. And once that effect wears off, not only is the remaking, the healing, whatever's been changed, going to likely revert back, but you're also going to be in a world of new hurt as well. Crucially, it's important to remember the context here, though, because we simply don't have all the facts. Kisuke's Bankai disengages involuntarily because of Askin's poison and the fact that Kisuke himself is about to die. So, what would happen if he simply disengaged the Bankai of his own accord while perfectly healthy? Do his stitches only open so violently and so quickly because of the nature of the Bankai's collapse, or does this happen every single time he uses Bankai, which is why he's so reticent to use it at all? Because if it's the case that this does happen every single time, regardless of circumstance, then it makes the Bankai a lot deadlier to use. There is far more risk involved. It means Kisuke has to be measured and careful about what parts of himself he chooses to restructure, to remake, and how many. The eyes made perfect sense. He needed to be able to see, really above all else, and the arm was just an additional power-up to ensure he had the upper hand over Askin at close range. It seems likely Kisuke could have restructured anything. He could have restructured his legs as well, perhaps to make himself move even faster, or his other arm too, but that's a gamble. If you're going to be seriously wounded by your own Bankai in the aftermath, then it makes sense to try and limit the amount of changes you make to yourself, and that creates a sort of metagame of control that Kisuke has to adhere to in the midst of combat. What do I need to restructure the most, and why? Where should my priorities go? What will give me the greatest upper hand, and how? Now, while we don't know for sure, I would assume that all of the alterations that Kisuke has made to himself are also coming undone when the stitches reopen. So his arm returns to its previous strength, and perhaps he's also going to lose his eyesight once again. Of course, these concerns only apply if Kisuke is restructuring either himself or an ally. Now, as for the earlier tease of Kisuke's Bankai, where he mentions his Bankai being unsuited for training or giving people strength, well, I half agree, based on what we know. Let's take the example given in the manga. If Kisuke were to train Chad. Now, Kisuke could presumably use his Bankai to restructure Chad's limbs and get them to the point where Chad received such a physical buff in that moment as to be capable of keeping up with Kisuke a little closer, and therefore training at even greater heights for potentially even longer. Again, that's another issue. We don't know what the limitations or restrictions of Benehime's remaking ability actually are, if any. What's the ceiling on how much stronger Benehime can make a limb? Kisuke is already an exceptionally powerful hand-to-hand combatant, one who was a member of the 2nd Division, and yet he's able to improve the strength of his left arm, I would argue considerably based on what we see him do with it, simply by using his Bankai, so where's the upper limit? And anyway, once the Bankai was disengaged, Chad would find himself greatly injured. I guess the question of whether or not it's worth it depends on the gains that Chad would have seen as a result of even more intensive training. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the Shinigami are perfectly capable of fixing virtually any wound with relative ease. Any drawbacks that come about as a result of Kisuke's Bankai, especially if used in a safe environment, by which I mean there are no enemies around, are only going to be temporary for the most part. No matter how injured you are, the Gotei 13 will be able to fix it up unless something truly drastic is altered. Speaking of there being enemies around, that leads me on to a couple of final questions. When is using Kannonbiraki Benehime Aratame considered worth the risk, and why did he use it against Askin? So, to start with, when is it worth the risk? Why didn't he use his Bankai against Aizen when the fate of Karakura Town and by extension the Royal Palace was on the line? Well, to be fair to Kisuke, that question can be asked of a lot of characters, to be honest. I mean, what's more egregious? Kisuke not using his Bankai, or Isshin not even bothering to use his Shikai? Now, the obvious answer to why Kisuke didn't use his Bankai against Aizen, that I imagine most people will go to initially, is, well, as we see in his battle against Askin, this Bankai has a range that, perhaps indiscriminately, affects people even if Benehime isn't touching them directly, as we see when Askin's arm is split open. And that certainly appears to be true on the surface, leading you to think, well, if Kisuke used his Bankai against Aizen, Yoruichi and Isshin would have no choice but to be caught up in the chaos. Except I'm not convinced that is correct, and I've maintained for a while that Kisuke simply split Askin's arm open like that to make him think that there was a range in which he had to operate, to kind of scare him straight as a first impression. Firstly, Yoruichi and Yushiro are right there when Kisuke uses Bankai anyway, so if there was some risk of even their unconscious forms being swept up involuntarily, Kisuke doesn't seem to care. Secondly, Grimjo arrives on the scene later on while Kisuke is still using Bankai, and isn't affected at all. It's not like Kisuke's Bankai suddenly goes wild and starts restructuring everyone who gets near it. No, every single move made by the Bankai is clearly calculated by Kisuke. It's obvious he doesn't want it to affect his allies, so it doesn't. Which again brings up the question of its so-called range. Why do we never see this happen again? Kisuke gets in close to Askin on numerous occasions, the two of them even locking blades, but Askin is never affected by the Bankai again. The way Askin's arm splits open at the start of the fight, and the way it seals itself shut again when he jumps backwards, absolutely implies that there is an area of effect for Kisuke's Bankai, a radius within which Askin will be seemingly automatically targeted, and then when he leaves it, he will be free of said target. But nothing we see in the rest of the fight seems to suggest this, seems to corroborate this. Which again makes me think that Kisuke simply targeted Askin's arm and then led him to believe that he had managed to escape unscathed. And why would he do this? Well, it throws Askin off the scent. Kisuke's ultimate plan is to use his Bankai to connect the far-off edge of the Gift Bereich to where they are currently fighting, in the center of this giant dome. If Askin thinks that Kisuke's Bankai has a very limited range, which he himself has now apparently borne witness to, then he will never even consider the possibility that the Bankai could be secretly opening a passage in the Poison Dome some way away, across the cityscape, while they are in the middle of fighting. Also, don't forget the sequence of events and how they simply don't line up with what Kisuke says. We can see here in this panel just how far away Askin is from the Bankai when his arm is fixed, in quotes, and he does not break line of sight with the Bankai when this next event happens. Kisuke leaps behind Askin, slashes him, and then locks blades with him, after which Kisuke's arm is then restructured remotely by his Bankai. So, based on what Kisuke literally just said, this shouldn't be possible if that radius of effect actually existed around Benihime herself, which then begs another question. What's up with the remote restructuring anyway? How does that work? Benihime herself fixes Kisuke's eyes, but everything else that's restructured happens from afar. When Kisuke jumps Askin and slashes him, we can see several rows of stitches actively following Kisuke like strings, like a puppet. I feel like the most likely answer is that Kisuke connects himself to his Bankai, and so those stitches follow him around. I'm assuming it's because of these stitches flying through the air that Kisuke is then able to remake his arm. So why did Askin's arm not receive any stitches, despite the fact that we see stitches closing it up again? Well, if I had to guess, I would assume it's because nothing was changed. Kisuke just opened Askin's arm up to put the fear of God in him, essentially, and then closed it again without anything happening to sell the idea of the area of effect and Askin escaping it. But again, this is all speculative. We simply didn't see enough of the Bankai to know for sure. Basically, what I'm getting at is I'm not convinced Kisuke hasn't used his Bankai because he's worried about his allies being caught up in it. Everything we've seen indicates an extremely high level of calculated control on his part. It's not like Kyoraku's Bankai, Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju, where it's definitely more believable that he doesn't really have control over said area of effect. And so going back to the question of why Kisuke didn't use his Bankai against Aizen, if the answer isn't that he's concerned about wrapping up his allies in its area of effectability, which again I'm not convinced he is, I don't think that is why. It doesn't seem to track with everything we've seen it do, then why? Why wouldn't he use it when it seems to give such an obvious advantage? Well, there's a couple of reasons, in my opinion, why this would be. And it does play into what we have discussed so far. Kisuke likely calculated that even with his Bankai, it was very unlikely that he would become strong enough to deal with a now transcending Aizen, an Aizen who was actively evolving in front of them, and Kisuke would have to make so many changes to himself, potentially drastic changes, that he might end up dying in the end anyway once the Bankai was disengaged. Whether that was when he chose to disengage it himself, after which he would just be covered in stitches that were suddenly opening and bleeding profusely, or if Aizen perhaps inevitably defeated him as he does in the manga, that would cause Kisuke's Bankai to disengage, and he would have no control over the fact that he was now suddenly bleeding out like crazy. To me, that makes the most sense, that he calculated the risk, and it simply didn't make sense to do so, especially after he knew as well that he had already successfully fired a second secret Kido spell seal into Aizen, that ideally he needed to be conscious and alive to ensure worked in the end. If he was bleeding out as a result of using his Bankai to the point where he wasn't able to be there when Aizen was sealed, A, I don't think he'd want to miss that, but also B, in a very un-Kisuke fashion, he simply wouldn't be able to observe the results of this experiment, of this Kido spell, and ensure that everything went swimmingly. So with all that said, why did Kisuke choose to use his Bankai against Askin in that moment? The answer is fairly simple. There was nothing to lose. Yes, Kisuke knew that he would likely injure himself as a result of using his Bankai, but he'd already prepared for the eventuality that was to come. That being that once Askin died, his power would go crazy and likely result in Kisuke's own death, unless he was rescued in time. Presumably, he'd factored the injuries from his Bankai into that, and the fact that he simply wasn't going to be able to escape the Gift Ball Deluxe. And again, we only see Kisuke restructuring the very necessities in this fight. He fixes his eyes immediately, and then remakes his left arm to ensure he can overpower the Sternritter up close. He only changes those two things because he's busy putting his real plan into place elsewhere, and needs to keep Askin occupied. It's also possible that he knew that his Bankai would come apart once the Gift Ball Deluxe went crazy, and so didn't want to cover himself in too many stitches. But yes, as for why he seemed to fear using his Bankai, why he didn't want to use it until the exact right moment, for why his Bankai wasn't suited for training or giving people strength, it seems to be because, in my opinion, the Bankai does come with a sizable drawback. Every change Kisuke makes to himself and others will be forcibly undone, with the stitches reopening and causing him to bleed out. This means the Bankai needs to be utilised in a much more measured way than perhaps first appears. Yes, it seems to be limitlessly versatile, but actually you have to be rather careful with how you choose to use it, with what you choose to use it on. And again, I think that's actually really cool. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you took some value away from it as well. Do let me know your thoughts on Kisuke's Bankai and the minutiae surrounding it down in the comments below. Do you think I'm right about this? This is why Kisuke chooses to use his Bankai in very select moments, at very select times. Does this seem to be a pretty big drawback to you? I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments below. Is this a way Kisuke can continue to improve his Bankai in the future? Let me know how you feel as well about my theory as to why Kisuke doesn't use Bankai in the battle against Aizen and why I think it's different to what I assume most people seem to think. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Alright everyone, until next time, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already. It's quick, it's easy, it's free to do, and it is helping the channel enormously. It helps get us more exposure, more reach in the run-up to Core 4 coming out of the 1000 Year Blood War Arc anime, and I would love to hit 300,000 subs by the end of the year. It's only going to be possible again with your help. I'm not sure we're going to make it, but I'd love to try it nonetheless. Check out the Patreon as well. Again, it would be wonderful to have you there, supporting the channel that extra step further, ensuring we can keep the lights on, like everyone who is in the credits of this video is doing. Again, your support is massively appreciated. I want to give you all a huge thank you and a massive shout out as well. Alright guys, well, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.